Hello, I'm Thomas Tulloch, and this is Filmmakering Like a Boss. You want to filmmake like a boss? You need a camera. You got a camera, you got camera settings. ISO, shutter speed, f-stop. What even are these? What do they do? How do they do it? And how do they affect my image? Well, I'll tell you. Don't worry, it's not that confusing. I got you covered. I'm going to try to explain it in a way that is easy to understand. First, I'm going to briefly explain what each of these settings are physically doing inside the camera. So if you're like, I don't really care about what they're doing, I just want to know how they affect my image so I know how to use them, you can skip ahead a little bit. There's a link in the place where links generally are to a time code when I get to that. We have three settings we need to look at. And to better understand each of these three settings, you have to understand what is actually happening in your camera when you shoot video. Now, there is no real right or wrong answer. It's all about the look that you personally are trying to achieve. But understanding these things will help you achieve the look that you want. The whole system is built around exposing the camera's sensor to light. The sensor is the thing that takes the image, records it, and translates it to a digital signal that the memory card can record. So the amount of light that physically hits the sensor determines what the image looks like. Make sense? If I'm not making sense, if you're not getting what I'm saying, go ahead and ask me a question in the comments and stuff. So you have the sensor in the back of the camera, then you have the body and the lens doing different things to allow different amounts of light through to the sensor. Light comes in through the lens, through the camera body, and then hits the sensor in the back. If I take off the lens, you can see right in the front of the sensor is a shutter. In this case, this is a DSLR, so the shutter has a mirror on it, reflecting the image to another mirror that I can see when I look through the viewfinder right here. And behind that mirror is the shutter, and behind the shutter is the sensor, as opposed to a mirrorless camera where there is no mirror. And instead, when you look through the viewfinder, you're actually looking at a little mini LCD screen that's showing you what the sensor is seeing. Now, what's actually happening with the shutter speed is really cool, and the slow-mo guys actually uploaded a video showing this process in slow motion. I highly recommend you watch that video. I'll put the link in the place where links generally are, because it'll give you a whole new appreciation for what's going on inside your camera. Basically, what's happening is that mirror is lifting up, letting light through to the shutter, then the shutter opens up and lets light through to the sensor. And the rate at which the shutter opens up is determined by the shutter speed. Now, this is not to be confused with frame rate. Just because the shutter is open does not actually mean the camera's creating a frame. Though frame rate and shutter speed go hand in hand, they are two separate things. And I'll do a whole other video about frame rates, so, subscribe and stuff. And then we have the ISO, which is the sensor's sensitivity to light. The lower the ISO setting, the less light the sensor is going to let itself see. The higher the setting, the more light the sensor is going to let itself see. And thus, we have arrived at the f-stop. Not to diminish the importance of the other two settings, but this setting is particularly important for you to understand. The f-stop is something that is contained not within the body itself, but within the lens. Inside the lens, there's a little adjustable diaphragm. This is called the aperture. The aperture does not open and close with the shutter. Instead, it's set to a specific setting and stays there, unless you change it, affecting the amount of light that makes it through to the shutter and then to the lens. So the aperture is like the initial gatekeeper of the light. I like that. Gatekeeper of the light. That sounds really epic. Gatekeeper of the light. And the setting for that aperture is controlled by the f-stop. Now, this part can be a little confusing. It actually took me a while to wrap my head around this, but the lower the number of the f-stop, the more wide open the aperture is. So an f-stop setting of 1.8 is a lot more wide open than an f-stop setting of 8.0. So the ISO and the shutter speed are controlled by the camera, and the f-stop is controlled by the lens. Now this means once you get a camera with specific ISO and shutter speed settings, you can still improve the quality of your image by getting a different lens. Now, the kit lens that most DSLRs come with is fine. It's a perfectly usable and acceptable lens. And when you're just starting out, there's nothing wrong with using it. But it does have some limitations. So when you can it's a good idea to upgrade and get newer, better lenses. For example, the kit lens cannot open its aperture wider than 3.4 when zoomed out, and when you zoom in, it closes to about 5.0. That's pretty closed. I'll put a link in the place where links generally are to some of the lenses that I use, that I recommend, that I use regularly. Okay, Tom, that's all great information, but you're making my head spin. So just get to it. How do I use this information to improve my image quality? Okay, we're here. Magic timecode time. Starting with the f-stop. The f-stop is displayed as a number, point another number. For example, 2.8, which is what I'm filming on right now, or 8.0, or 11.5. A number, point another number. You can think of the F in f-stop like it stands for focus. This setting basically determines your depth of field. How much of your frame is in focus versus what's out of focus. Right now you can see me, I'm clearly in focus, but my background is pretty well out of focus. The difference between me in focus and my background being out of focus, that's depth of field, that is controlled by the f-stop. The lower the f-stop setting, the more wide open the aperture, the more out of focus my background's going to be. The lens that I'm shooting on right now has an f-stop setting of 2.8. Watch what happens when I change it to something higher. Now my f-stop is set to 11.0. I wouldn't normally go this far closed, but I wanted to prove my point, and that's just my personal taste. If you want to go this far closed, by all means. As you do though, you'll notice that the image is getting darker because you're letting less light in, so you have to adjust other settings accordingly, like the ISO. Before my ISO was set to 400, now it's at 1600, but we'll get to that. As I'm filming this shot, my ISO is set to 1600 and my f-stop is at 16, and according to the light meter on this camera, this is perfectly exposed. Now, it can be hard to tell sometimes with the little LCD screen attached to the camera, which is why I usually shoot with an exterior monitor, which I didn't bring. But anyways, what you should be seeing right now that I have a higher f-stop is more things in focus. The background behind me should be more in focus. Now, why would one want to film at a higher f-stop? Well, if you close your aperture a little bit, more things are in focus, which makes it better for filming action scenes, something where there's a lot of movement. You want to film a lightsaber duel, for example, then it's easier to not miss focus if you have a wider depth of field, which you get by closing the aperture, by turning up the f-stop. Wider depth of field means there's more space for things to be in focus. Shallow depth of field means less space for things to be in focus. Does that make sense? Personally, I don't like the way this looks. It kind of looks like I'm on a green screen, which I'm not, but that's just my personal taste. If this is the kind of look that you're going for, then by all means go for it. But I'm going to switch back to the other settings. Now let's move from the lens into the camera and talk shutter speed. The shutter speed is usually displayed as a 2 or 3 digit number, usually located near the light meter. And if you don't see the light meter, just press the take a picture button halfway and the light meter should show up. Now, as I said before, the shutter speed and the frame rate are two different things, but they're intertwined, meaning where you set your frame rate, what frame rate you're filming in, that determines where you set your shutter speed. Basically, the shutter speed controls the smoothness of the motion by adding or decreasing motion blur. Higher shutter speeds have less motion blur. Lower shutter speeds, more motion blur. Why would one want motion blur over smoothness? Well, there's sort of a cinematic look that a lot of filmmakers try to achieve, and that look closely mimics what the human eye sees. The human eye sees motion blur. Put your hand in front of your face, you're going to see the motion blur. You set your shutter speed higher and you're going to have less motion blur, so it's going to be a lot more smoother and it's going to look unnatural. Again, not necessarily wrong. If that's what you want, then go for it, but it helps to be aware that that's what that does. That way you can achieve that look if that's what you want. Now, to get that cinematic look, the go-to frame rate is 24 frames a second, or 23 point something something. And a good rule of thumb is to set the shutter speed at double the frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames a second, you should have your shutter speed set to 48. Or 45 or 60, which is what most cameras have, but that's close enough. I suggest you play with this. Get out your camera, point it at something that moves, set it to 24 frames a second, and shoot with a shutter speed of 45, and then ramp it up a couple hundred and pay attention to how different it looks, how much more smoother it's going to look. You'll see for yourself. Note that as you kick up your shutter speed, your image brightness is going to change, so adjust your ISO to compensate. Now let's talk about the ISO. The ISO is usually displayed as a series of numbers starting at 100 and going up exponentially. So 100, 200, then 400, then 800, then 1600, and up into the thousands. This is really the setting that you want to change to adjust the brightness of your image. So if you're filming outdoors, like I am right now, then you usually want to have your ISO at about 100, depending on the time of day. Or I have an ND filter on this camera right now, so my ISO is at about a little over 200. And the less light there is on what you're trying to shoot, the higher you're going to want your ISO. But adjust this setting with caution, because the higher you set your ISO, the more grain noise you're going to get in the darker areas of your screen, until you get to a point where your image is just no longer usable. Again, if this is something that you're going for, then go for it. But generally, grain noise is not really desirable. And if you have a cheaper camera, then here is where you're really going to start to notice the limitations in the quality of your camera. Nicer, more expensive cameras can operate at higher ISO settings with less grain noise. I'm filming this right now on a Canon 70D, which is a very good camera, but not a great camera. The ISO on this goes all the way up to 6400. So I can go up that high, but I find that if I go up higher than about 400, I start seeing that unwanted grain noise. I can push it to about 500 if I really have to, but that's really the ceiling of usable image with this camera. Right now, my ISO is set to 400. Watch what happens when I kick it up. I have now maxed out the ISO at 6400, and yes, the image got a lot brighter, so I had to close the aperture to, I forget what I set it to. It's probably at about 8.0. But look at all the grain noise, particularly in the darker areas of my background. Normally I would not use this shot, but I wanted to illustrate a point. That doesn't really look very good, at least in my opinion. Again, if that's what you want, then by all means, but you can avoid this by understanding how to use your camera settings. And if you're shopping for a camera, then this is one setting you really want to pay attention to. Not just how high the ISO goes, but how well that camera performs at higher ISOs. But if you already have a camera and you're struggling with film grain on higher ISO settings and you're trying to figure out how to, get a better image with your camera's ISO limits, then at that point, what you really want to do is bring the ISO back down to where it's comfortable and put some more light on your subject. Remember, a great image is not just in the camera. Set yourself up for success. Use more light. But I'll do a whole other video about lighting, so subscribe for all that stuff. Okay, I'm going to change the ISO back now. So there it is. ISO, shutter speed, f-stop. I hope I explained it in a way that is relatively easy to understand. If not, if you have any questions, hit me up in the comment section. And subscribe so you can follow along on the next episode of Filmmakering Like a Boss.
Hey, I owe you!